The schooner had fought hard in battle as they retreated, but she was unfortunately slower than the rest of the fleet. She lagged behind as the British gained on her, watching her comrades get farther and farther away. The enemy surrounded her, leaving her with a choice: surrender or sink. Welcome to Fast Facts Friday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some. Severe discretion is advised. Okay, everyone, let's get into it. The American Revolutionary War was the fight for American independence from the British. It began on April 19, 1775 and lasted until September 3, 1783, ending with the American victory, becoming an independent country apart from the British. We always think of Paul Revere, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but we hardly think of the naval battles that took place, or the ships that were lost. The first notable ship lost during the American Revolution was during the Americans' first offensive action against the British on Lake Champlain, a lake that borders New York State, Vermont, and the Canadian province of Quebec. 3 weeks after the British had taken action against the Patriots at Lexington and Concord on May 10, 1775, the Americans would attack the British at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Under cover of darkness, the force of 81 entered the fort side by side and took the small, sleeping garrison by surprise, first at Fort Ticonderoga. By the end of May, they'd have Crown Point as well. Here, they seized the schooner Catherine, and she'd be the first designated ship of the Continental Navy, being named Liberty. Benedict Arnold immediately assumed command of Liberty when she arrived at Ticonderoga, and they set off for St. John's, Canada, at the northern end of the lake. Here, he surprised and captured the King's sloop Betsy, renaming her Enterprise. Arnold felt confident, reporting, quote, "At present, we are masters of the lake." The Americans, having the full advantage of the road into Quebec, began to make immediate plans to invade Canada. They thought the Canadians would gleefully join in their cause, but this sadly wasn't the case. The capture of St. John took 2 months longer than expected, but did yield 2 prize vessels, the schooner Royal Savage and a row galley that was later re-rigged as a schooner and named Revenge. The Americans then took St. Jean, and they ran the gunboats Hancock and Schuyler over the rapids at Chambly, and followed the St. Lawrence River to Montreal. Due to bad weather, little Canadian support, diminishing supplies, little hard money, and diminishing enlistments, the rebel colonial army attacked the city of Quebec with disastrous consequences. The men were defeated and forced to winter outside the city's walls. Despite famine and disease, they maintained their siege of the city throughout the harsh winter. Reinforcements from New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut marched hundreds of miles north along Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence River, but they were too few and too late to save the American effort here. If you're not American, you might have noticed many of us Americans are quite stubborn, and this was true even then. They stayed at their siege of Quebec throughout the winter of 1775 to 1776, but they knew that the English assistance would arrive soon as the St. Lawrence River was clear of ice. In May of 1776, a British convoy from Europe reached Quebec with 10,000 British regulars and German mercenary troops aboard. Their arrival triggered a hasty and disorganized American retreat from Canada. It was an oh shit moment that should have come sooner. The Americans stopped at Île-aux-Noix in the Richelieu River to regroup, but the scene was desperate. 3,000 ailing soldiers camped on the island, with 15 to 20 dying daily because of their severe need of medical supplies. They soon realized they had no hope of defending the island, and so the remaining troops evacuated and retreated to Crown Point. Encamped at the ruins of the fort, they had better access to supplies, but disease continued to ravage the troops. The Americans were resting, and during this time, the British awaited orders at St. John's, prepared to invade. Despite knowing the American troops were doing very poorly, they decided not to take action. For the moment, the Americans' 4 little ships captured in 1775 were able to block the British advance. Despite the condition of their army, in July of 1776, the Americans had ships patrolling the waters while the British had no fleet available. Until the British could get naval supremacy on Lake Champlain, their army could not continue forward unprotected. Throughout the summer of 1776, the Americans and the British worked furiously at opposite ends of the lake to build naval squadrons. Scansborough was where the Americans built their ships, and in just 2 months they produced 1 small galley, 8 new gunboats, and 4 row galleys. By early October 1776, the American fleet had 16 ships ready to rock and roll. And this episode is only getting started. If you are enjoying this episode and want to hear more about ships, their careers, and their wrecks, check out our main show Shipwreck Sunday every Sunday night at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Alright folks, let's get into the Battle of Valcour Island and the first American ships that sank in the American Revolution. The British and American fleets met on the western side of Valcour Island on October 11, 1776. The British had the advantage, as all of their ships were bigger and crewed by professional sailors under the command of skilled naval officers. The American fleet, commanded by Benedict Arnold, consisted of 8 gunboats, 3 row galleys, 2 schooners, 1 sloop, 1 cutter, and 1 bateau. However, Arnold had strategically selected this site for battle. Valcour Island was halfway between Crown Point and St. John's, providing a natural defensive position and relief from increasingly blustery autumn weather. His ships sheltered the west side of the island, knowing the British would sail past on the east. The Americans were outgunned and outmanned in seamanship, but they hoped the British vessels would struggle beating back against the wind after spotting the American line at anchor. On the morning of October 11, 1776, the British sailed right past the southern end of Valcour Island, then turned north against the wind, just as the Americans had hoped. This worked to the American advantage, as most of the British ships were unable to work far enough against the wind to engage them. Instead, the bulk of the fighting that day was undertaken by British gunboats that rode within musket range of the American line. Both sides sustained significant casualties, and the American schooner Royal Savage ran aground on the southwestern corner of Valcour Island. The battle stopped when nightfall came, and 1 hour after the fighting had stopped, the gunboat Philadelphia sank from damage suffered in the exchange of cannon fire. This is considered the first major American ship sunk in the American Revolution. At dusk, Arnold called a council of war, and the American officers agreed to attempt an escape by rowing past the British line. The British burned the Royal Savage, which provided a distraction on the eastern side of the inlet, and the American fleet rowed south to safety along the New York shoreline with oars muffled and a shrouded light in each vessel's stern. Remarkably, they went on undetected by the British, and by morning they safely reached Schuyler Island and halted to stop any leaks and mend their sails. Arnold had abandoned 2 weakened gunboats during the fight, Spitfire and Jersey. The next morning, the British awoke and expected to wrap up a decisive victory. It must have been shocking and embarrassing to find the Americans had snuck away that night, and the British then set off in pursuit. As they worked their way south, they captured the abandoned gunboat Jersey, though Spitfire had already sunk. Meanwhile, the Americans were exhausted as they sailed against a southerly wind, rowing for their lives. On the morning of October 13th, near Split Rock Mountain, the fresh British fleet caught up with the vessels that were straggling at the end of the American line. The British surrounded and captured the row galley Washington after she took several broadsides. The British pressed on in a running gun battle that threatened the row galley Congress and 4 lagging gunboats. Arnold, in command of Congress, ordered his men to run the 5 ships aground in Ferris Bay near Panton, Vermont. They then blew up the ships, denying them to the British. Then they narrowly escaped to Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. The British now controlled the waterway, while the Americans considered themselves lucky to still have 6 ships afloat, 4 of which had participated in the fight. The British couldn't follow up on their lake victory as the winds did not allow it, and so now it was time for the Americans to regroup. The schooner hull gleamed as water splashed upon it, and she headed alongside her fleet into battle. Little did she know it would be her last alongside the Americans. This Sunday on the next episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we get into the story of USS Alfred, one of the first American Navy ships.